Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And today we're going to dive into something that is going to have direct implications and major implications for everyone in the oil and gas space. And we're going to talk about and do a deep dive into the sweeping executive orders that were signed last week in Trump's first week in office. And Justin, we see a big shift at the federal level in terms of policies. And typically when new administrations come over, specifically if it's going from Democrat to Republican or vice versa, you see a dramatic change in policy. And that's exactly what we saw on Inauguration Day when Trump signed a slew of executive orders that could potentially reshape the landscape for the entire domestic energy sector and then have potential impacts on mineral and royalty owners. And the reason I think this is timely, certainly it's something that has been probably weighing on a lot of our minds, based on all these changes. What's it going to mean for us at the end of the day? And in fact, I got an email from a longtime listener named Greg. He says, I always appreciate listening to your podcast. They're a breath of fresh air, although sometimes I get lost in the weeds. He says, I'm one of the many who have inherited mineral rights in Texas. That said, recent comments from our new president has my head spinning to try to make a guess at the future of LNG. So some podcasts have been adding extra posts during the golden age that is upon us. Any chance in doubling up on your comments and observations, it would be most appreciated. So thank you for that reminder, Greg. This was a good reminder that we needed to really sit down and take a look at these new policies and changes and see what they were going to mean. But Justin, what was your take after seeing all these executive orders get announced?
I always find it interesting with the executive orders or any kind of law when it comes to that level of law. And there's hard to actually understand what are they saying and what are the impacts going to be. This is a huge cutting of the red tape, but it doesn't mean that it dictates what the market is going to do. So that's the other half of the equation, which is yet to be seen of the outcome of this red tape cutting, what the market's going to do with that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like we were talking before we hit record, there was an article that RBN Energy released on their blog. They do a daily blog post. It's a really good source of information. And the one today was talking about total shareholder return for diversified energy companies and how they were down significantly in 2024, kind of across the board. And so to your point, Justin, it'll be interesting to see if the market takes this news and really doubles down on energy and if we see better returns this year. And so I guess that's fingers crossed that that's the case, because ultimately that means that if the stock prices are going up, that means commodity prices are doing well. And so that means that we all, from a mineral and royalty owner standpoint, should do well too. But Justin, let's dive into the details here. But do you want to talk about setting the stage first?
Yeah, let's set the stage here. So if you own minerals in an area without any federal mineral rights, then many of these changes won't have a direct impact per se on the development of your interest. In most cases, the State Oil and Gas Commission or agency is responsible for permitting new wells and for evaluating impacts on surface owners or the environment. But as we talked about with the Biden administration, much of this will apply really to federal lands. That ban that was on drilling was for federal lands. So if your minerals are completely private, then it may have less of an impact than it would for somebody who owns federal minerals. That said, federal rules like the EPA's methane rule, which went into effect last year and would have an impact on all oil and gas operations. This went into effect November 12th of 2024, and the EPA finalized a rule to reduce the methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. And Matt, we did an episode and we talked about this. That was episode 267. Will the new EPA methane tax get passed on to royalty owners? That would have been a heavy weight for regulation on them. The rule was facilitating the collection of waste emissions and essentially incentivizing them to take near-term action because they're valuable energy resources and then reduce methane emissions. And Matt, when we hear conserve valuable energy resources, that means reduce your drilling.
Yeah, this methane tax is kind of an interesting one because certainly in principle, I think everybody can agree, right? We want to reduce waste and reduce methane emissions, especially from a mineral and royalty owner perspective. The more of that gas that stays in the pipe will get sold and we'll get paid royalties on it. If they end up flaring or it gets vented or kind of escapes into the atmosphere, we won't get paid on it. So that is definitely a benefit to the environment and then also to mineral and royalty owners. The real issue with it is that they're singling out the oil and gas industry to pay fees based on the amount of emissions that they make. And so that's an arbitrary decision at the federal level to say, okay, we don't like this industry, so you guys have to pay us more because you're emitting methane. But then these other industries that also have maybe questionable environmental, from a global perspective, right? They say you get a free pass, you don't have to worry about it. So you're emitting methane here in the US, we're going to penalize you for that versus those solar panels were made in China using coal. We're going to turn a blind eye to that and we're going to actually give you tax incentives to do more of that. So it's not really great from an overall environmental perspective when you look at the bigger picture. So I'd like to see that get adjusted or overturned just because of the burden that it's going to place on the industry, like you mentioned. Ultimately, it's more expensive to operate wells, and that's going to have a direct impact on how many wells they can drill. So the first indication that that's probably going to get a hard look, and they'll challenge it, and it'll probably have to go to the courts. And I'm not sure that they can just summarily overturn it. But the acting EPA administrator that's in place while the current administrator appointment is waiting to get approved, they let go of members of two of the EPA advisory committees, the Science Advisory Board and the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. And in an email, a press officer for the EPA said this move seeks to reverse the politicization of SAB and CASC made by the previous administration. So, Justin, that is kind of interesting. And they've indicated that they're going to try to overturn this as well.
Yeah, you said them out. And so these executive orders come with a bit of action as well, which is really encouraging. And to kind of, again, just summarize this, the two key takeaways. One is that federal lands are going to be more impacted than private lands when it comes to these regulations. And so an example of an area would be southeast New Mexico and the Permian Basin. That's Lee and Eddy counties. That is a great example of where there's a patchwork of fee, state, and federal mineral rights. So development there may really be increased because that red tape's no longer there from the administration. And then, Matt, that EPA rule, it really could be a large decrease on the cost of doing business, or at least not an increase in the cost of doing business from coming change down the road. And these executive orders go on and do some more slashing at cost of doing business that's been implemented on oil and gas companies. And so, Matt, let's get into the details of the exact executive orders.
Yeah, so just kind of high level, the president declared what he's calling a national energy emergency. And so what that'll allow him to do, it increases the powers in the executive branch in that kind of national emergency scenario where they can do things around streamlining approval processes and things like that. And we'll dive into the specifics here. And then the other big order I think that's most impactful to the oil and gas industry is Unleashing American Energy executive order. And essentially, you could think of that one as a complete reversal of the previous administration's approach to energy. Instead of prioritizing renewables, they're looking to focus more on maximizing production in traditional energy sources. So that's oil, natural gas, and coal. And the tagline here is drill, baby, drill, right? It was what Trump has said many times. I don't think that's going to happen. And we'll talk about why that is probably not the case just because of economics. But the things that they're looking at that is going to be most impactful is they're going to order a complete review of regulations that might be holding back domestic energy production. And, there are a couple of key points there. I think within that Unleashing American Energy, directly related to your question, Greg, on LNG, Trump ordered the Secretary of Energy to restart reviews of applications for approvals of liquefied natural gas export projects. And so about a year ago, former President Biden had paused the Department of Energy's approvals of LNG exports to certain countries lacking a free trade agreement with the U.S. And so that includes China and European Union members in order to, quote, study the environmental and economic impacts of such exports. And so effectively what that was doing was putting those projects on hold, and they couldn't move forward with any of the engineering, design, any of the financial decisions, investment decisions until they have those permits. Those are kind of the first step in the process. And so a lot of those projects that were slated to get approval and to have those applications reviewed were put on ice for a year. And so that delays when those can get built and come online. And so that has a direct impact on the demand side of the LNG equation and natural gas in particular. And so ultimately, what they're looking at is try to expeditiously issue licenses to projects. And we are the largest LNG exporter currently and can remain that if we allow those new projects to be permitted. And so that, again, is a very bullish signal for natural gas prices here in the US, because if those additional projects are built, it represents additional demand for natural gas, which, again, supply and demand, the more demand there is, the higher the prices go generally. So, Justin, I think that was probably one of the most significant takeaways from that Unleashing American Energy executive order. What was your take?
No, you said it, man. I mean, that's something that we've talked about for a long time, that the LNG export is really a crucial part to balancing the supply and demand. Another thing that has some major impacts is that it changes how federal agencies handle environmental reviews during the permitting process. And under these new rules, agencies can only consider environmental factors that are explicitly required by law, not additional considerations they might have added on their own. So when conducting those reviews, they must use proven scientific methods to measure environmental impacts. And Matt, this is starkly different because the agencies have kind of come up with their own frameworks for how it is that they're going to judge these impacts and manage these impacts. And they can only consider what's specifically required now. And it'll really standardize the scientific methods rather than, using agency developed criteria, which seem to kind of ebb and flow depending on the political stance of the administration and in the White House at the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, that could directly impact the methane rule, right? So EPA has a certain framework for assessing CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. And so it's saying, okay, we got to go back to the drawing board and standardize that across all agencies and make sure that we're applying quote unquote proven. And I think if there was some more fringe data that wasn't quite confirmed by multiple studies or something like that, then it would be something they would not use going forward, at least for the next 4 years. So ultimately, I think the takeaway is these changes are going to streamline the permitting process that would make it more predictable for companies that are looking to make these types of investments. And it limits the scope of the environmental reviews to what's legally required. And so ultimately, that means that those approvals are going to be expedited because the approvals aren't going to take years to get done, right? It doesn't have all these extra studies you have to do and all these extra experts you have to hire to do those studies. And so I think if you shorten that time period, then ultimately means those facilities can get built quicker and have a direct impact on our energy security and exports and things like that. So yeah, that's my take. What do you think?
No, you said it, man. And for a business, this is certainty. So knowing that you can get these projects approved, that it's not going to get held up in a political issue. And then also time is money. Being able to decrease the time that it takes to do these permits allows the companies to move faster and then therefore at less cost.
That's an excellent point. And to that end, I think we've had a lot of issues with the industry getting permits and building new pipeline infrastructure. And part of this National Energy Emergency Declaration, it gives these federal agencies that are involved broad authority to expedite energy project approvals. So if you think about projects like pipelines from Canada bringing heavy oil to the US, like that Keystone XL, which eventually got the axe, I could see that potentially getting a new name and then also, coming and again in a different form and that potentially getting approval. And certainly all this stuff is going to get challenged in court. We can't kid ourselves that this stuff is just a rubber stamp that, new permits are going to get approved or environmental reviews are going to get completed. There'll be a litany of lawsuits trying to delay these projects and things like that by environmental activists, environmental groups, which there needs to be a healthy challenge from an environmental side of things, because everybody that I spoke with, so I'm pretty middle of the road, but I have talked to people since the election that are pretty far on the right. And those folks are hunters, fishermen, things like that. They'll consider themselves environmentalists as well. No, but everybody wants clean air and clean water. Nobody wants to pollute the environment. I think that's a principle that we can all agree on. It's just exactly how do you go about ensuring that you have clean air and clean water, and what is objectively going to impact that from communities and to the environment, and balancing that give and take. Every energy source has a trade-off, right? From both environmental and social side of things. Wind energy is going to get a lot more scrutiny now, I think, because of, the whales. There's a whole thing with on the East Coast, and, the right whale is like potentially facing extinction because they're washing up on shore. They're getting impacted by the harmonics of these large offshore wind turbines. And, we're just sort of turning a blind eye on that. And that should get a healthy look at, is that the right thing that we should be doing in that area? Because of the impact on wildlife and just equally as much as an oil and gas project should get. And that hasn't been the case for a long time.
No, you said it, Matt. It's a real reset of that, pulling politics into making decisions when it comes to energy policy. And Matt, something worth mentioning here is that because on private mineral rights, the states typically dictate the permitting process. Again, this really is going to have the largest impact on federal. So that said, for those that have private minerals, don't expect the process necessarily to speed up or be half the time. At the state level, those agencies will likely move at the same speed which they have been. So don't be surprised if that's the case. And there's also, with these significant changes in how the environmental agencies review, the administration revoked a Carter-era framework for environmental impact statements and is requiring new guidelines within 30 days. And Matt, this is a huge reversal. That order has been a key part of the implementation of the 1970s National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. Under the new approach, agencies will prioritize efficiency and certainty in their reviews. And the chairman of the White House Council on Environmental Quality has been required to produce new guidelines for implementing NEPA within 30 days. And so, Matt, this is a huge change in the framework that we had been operating under for many years now, and hoping to revise that and streamline it, which the impact of that is truly unknown, but it could be massive.
Yeah, that could be a huge change in the timing of being able to get these projects approved. When I was working in the industry, several projects that I worked on were on BLM land, and they had the NEPA analysis and that environmental impact statement that took years to complete. Those documents are hundreds of pages long. They require very comprehensive analysis on having wildlife biologists and all these experts to look at the impact on flora and fauna and wildlife and migration patterns and everything. And they're extremely slow and time consuming to get done. Now, there's a good balance, and I think a great example of where there's been a good balance struck between industry and those environmental considerations is in the Pinedale Anticline in Wyoming, which is primarily on federal lands. And it's in an area that is migration, also things like sage grouse. So you have deer, sage grouse, and other raptors and things like that. And they evaluate those on a case by case basis and make sure that they're doing the drilling activity and doing the major work when those affected animals are not in the area. So, for example, when the antelope or when the deer have moved and they're migrated to another part of the state and they're not in that area, that's when they can come in and do the drilling. And so why not allow that? You have a balance of protecting wildlife and all of those things, but then also allowing the access to that energy that we need to enjoy our standard of life, frankly. So there's a good example where it's a win-win situation. And there's a good partnership between industry and the BLM in that situation. So I think there's certainly ways to do it and more efficient process. And I don't think they should throw it out. So it's good to see that they're going to take a healthy look at how to streamline that whole process. So to your point, Justin, examples of where mineral owners could be impacted by these types of reviews. So like Justin said, if you have private mineral rights that are adjacent to or in an area with a lot of federal minerals that would require your private minerals to get pooled with federal lands, that means the operator is going to have to go through those NEPA reviews and have to go to the BLM to get approval, in addition to the State Oil and Gas Commission. And so if there's shorter timelines at the federal level, that means that your minerals are more likely to get developed. The previous administration wasn't issuing permits, at all to a certain extent, or new oil and gas leases. Now, if there's, the operator has to get an oil and gas lease on those federal minerals in order to build a federal drilling unit to develop your minerals as well, then these changes will could have a direct impact. Obviously, all things being equal, if it's economic to drill, if it's a good area for them to drill. So all those things. But Justin, now the things that will impact everybody, I think, are the more macroeconomic things like the refilling of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Do you want to talk about what those plans are?
Yep. So another thing that has been talked about is refilling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as you alluded to, Matt. And it's not been formalized in an executive order, but the administration stated the goal of refilling the reserve, which can have some serious market implications. They need to purchase 320 million barrels of oil to fill the SPR completely, which would create substantial additional demand in the market. Right now, the current prices are about $75 per barrel, and this represents a potential $24 billion in government purchases. For mineral right owners, this could help provide a floor for oil prices and create steady demand. It's very likely that the administration will seek to do that slowly and progressively so that they don't create a shock to the market. But Matt, that demand will be good to see.
Yeah, it'll be good to see. The question mark is with the budget constraints. We're up against another budget ceiling, I believe, kind of quietly announced by Janet Yellen here a couple of weeks ago. And so now they're going to have to go back to the drawing board and take a look at spending. And to the extent that we can cut waste, this whole Doge department that Elon Musk is leading, if they can cut significant waste and spending that would have been earmarked to these other wasteful projects, that could free up the money to do things like this. And I think that would be where they would look to spend that type of savings. It wouldn't be incremental on top of other spending because we're already needing to reduce spending. But yeah, that'll be interesting to see if that actually comes to fruition. It may be more challenging to implement to the level that he's talked about, but we'll see. Could be good.
You said it, man. Another thing that is easy to miss when just reading through the words in the executive orders is the market implications this could have. Something we talked about at the end of the shale boom was investment. What really happened was investment dried up. These businesses could no longer get the very inexpensive loans they needed to drill a ton of wells. Then some of the people in the industry like Wood Mackenzie and Rapid Energy Group are suggesting these orders could redirect significant investment back towards oil and gas. And that has some really important implications. We've seen underinvestment in oil and gas production over the past decade, even as demand has hit record levels. In fact, global investment in oil and gas production has fallen from almost $900 billion in 2014 to around $570 billion in 2024. So, Matt, that would be really interesting to see. And before we hit record, we were talking about the opposing side of that, which is the incentives that are going to be ending for green energy initiatives. So is that going to skew the profitability there? That's highly likely. And, the large funds, Vanguard, some of the others, they're looking to make a return. And so that is going to, by nature, shift where the money is going and where they're going to invest in projects.
I think that's a great point. I think that there's two things to think about when you think about oil and gas investment falling. 2014 was an era where companies were not profitable, and so they were spending more than they brought in each year, and that have ultimately ended up in a lot of those companies going bankrupt. So I don't ever see us going back to that $900 billion mark. But to your point, Justin, if tax incentives for carbon capture and sequestration get rolled back or get changed and reduced, a great example of a company that's kind of leading the way in that area is Oxy with their direct air capture, carbon capture projects and building CO2 pipelines and things like that. If it's not as profitable to pursue those projects, then that funding is going to go away in terms of those investment decisions are not going to get made to build the next project or take it from a pilot to a commercial project. And what that means is they still have cash flow coming in from operations, from producing oil and gas and selling it to the market. So that means they would probably redeploy that capital on drilling more wells because that they know for sure is profitable, regardless of tax incentives. And so that is, I think, the thing to watch. I think the big thing to take away here from a mineral and royalty owner perspective, these changes are not going to happen overnight. I would expect this to be over the course of the next 4 years to see the impacts. Some of them will be more immediate, like if they're in 30 days come up with the streamlined NEPA review process, which that's a very short time period, but let's say they actually get that done, then that could mean quicker approvals for permits. And if they start holding oil and gas lease sales like they're supposed to again, then that means more leases and more projects getting approved and then more wells getting drilled over the next several years. It's not going to happen, in the next month or two. So, certainly keep an eye on these things. It's going to be a slow impact, but I think a positive impact overall for domestic energy. So if you have minerals and royalties, it is bullish from the standpoint of the actions that are being taken are going to put additional demand potentially for oil and gas. Certainly the natural gas side, that's a direct impact from these LNG projects and creating more demand for natural gas. And I think we'll see how that all plays out. But I think ultimately could mean more investment in oil and gas if the tax incentives for renewables get reduced. And then also the permitting gets streamlined means quicker development of our minerals. And, we'll kind of see what happens. But I think ultimately areas that are really interesting to watch, and it'd be Alaska. That is one thing that was really highlighted in those executive orders and trying to open those areas up for drilling again. I saw an article recently that talked about the pipeline that goes from the North Slope through Alaska. That pipeline is almost at sort of the minimum flow in order to keep that oil liquid because it's so cold up there. That's a big insulated pipe, goes above the ground. And I think it's something like 500,000 barrels a day is kind of where they're at now, which is near the minimum in order for that thing to keep flowing. So they need to fill that pipe in order to keep things going. So I think that is an interesting thing to watch. I'll believe it when I see it in terms of additional development and like ANWR and things like that, because every administration, whether it's Democrats blocking it or Republicans trying to open it up, nothing ever gets approved and actually gets drilled. So we'll see. But overall, I think the main takeaway is it's going to be bullish for the oil and gas industry and hopefully bullish for mineral and royalty owners from the standpoint of access to energy of all forms. And so I think that's kind of my takeaway. What is your takeaway on after reading through all of this?
I saw it as a huge cutting of red tape. It really opens and paves the way for some more efficient ways to go about the permitting. It removes the politics from energy development. And there's several things to remember. One, this is going to be held up in court with almost every change for a long time. These are going to have to work through the courts. They're going to have to get them enacted and have to fight for them. Drill, baby, drill, maybe the administration's stance, but companies are still going to be likely to prioritize profits over pure growth. We're not going to go back to the days of where, these companies are really expending more than they should be and putting themselves in danger of bankruptcy. The industry has really decided they really want to go for sustainable, consistent growth and play it safe to avoid the boom and bust cycle. It's really not great for anybody. But this cutting of red tape could change the economics some. It may make certain opportunities that were marginal before seem a lot more attractive for oil and gas companies. And overall, Matt, it's going to be a great thing for mineral rights owners and something they should keep an eye on. Like we said at the beginning of the show, it's just a sweeping change to the way that we have viewed energy policy, which is great.
Yeah, it's good to see more, hopefully, pragmatic approach to energy. Certainly with Chris Wright as the Secretary of Energy, I'm a big fan of his philosophy. I think it's really good. He's looking at all forms of energy, and we need to responsibly develop all forms of energy, including fossil fuels, including nuclear power and things like that. So that'll be interesting to see how the nuclear industry changes. And we haven't really talked about that with any of these executive orders. But I think that's the other thing to watch and see is that do they streamline the process for permitting new nuclear reactors and things like that? And that would be good to see as well. But I think it'll be interesting 4 years for sure, if nothing else, from an energy perspective. As things change, we'll keep you updated. And so stay tuned to the show and our news episodes where we'll cover the updates to these things. And if you're interested in learning more about any of the things we talked about today, whether the articles or the actual executive orders, we'll link to all that in the show notes, which you can always find at mineralrightspodcast.com. And every week I send out a newsletter to subscribers that summarizes the key takeaways from episodes like this one. So if you want some additional insight into the things that we talk about on the show, be sure to subscribe and you'll find a link there. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.